and thank you for joining us. We're here for the Stellenbosch Graduate Institute Executive Book Club. Our objective with this really is to read for you. We look at a book that is addressing the issues of executives and what we're experiencing in our day-to-day lives. We read that, we provide a bit of a summary and work through that. And then if you want to ask any questions, you can in the chat. Today's book is Howard Gardner, Changing Minds, the Art and Science of Changing Our Own and Other People's Minds, as thoughtfully read by Frick Landman, and he's going to take us through some ideas. And yes, over to you, Frick.
You're setting me up for failure. Thoughtfully read by.
Such a good book. I mean, do I need to change my mind about that, Frick?
I have to change my mind. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the book club. This was a great read. It's not a difficult read, and the Changing Minds, I think, is very applicable in the times that we are living, and has been actually for a long time. And I think this is what Gardner also says in the book. We all use this metaphor, what's the use of a mind if I can't change it? You have to change your mind. I've changed my mind about this. So we use this in daily, but we don't really research it. And if you see his background, his credentials, and you will see that it was very well researched. So this book is really about how minds change, and then how different forms of intellect or intelligence work. And I thought also, as a motive behind discussing this book, is so our audience is mostly made up of leaders, and leaders are in a space where they have to influence outwardly and inwardly in this process. And so if they do that, in whether it's in business or politics or art or music or whatever, they influence, and that influence has an effect on the minds and how people think, and also how they think about the world. And honestly, Rian, if I look at the culture of mind change in our country at the moment, and I see the national discourse, I see very little intelligent reasoning taking place. You see mostly mudslinging, almost as if people are sitting on fundamentalist positions and trying to convince one another. So hopefully this book will give us some insight into this space.
Absolutely, and Frick, that's also what, and I would love to, as we're getting into the book, but the big impression that I also got is very similar to what you just said, to say we, even from a very political context, and the book delves into that quite a lot in terms of how politicians utilize mind-changing aspects, but to sit and say that how do you change the narrative of a whole system, because sometimes that is the big changes that need to happen. And in terms of what you just said, I think that's so important, is the narrative is changing, but sometimes people don't even realize it, and that is what I also found a very interesting aspect of the Changing Minds element that Gardner is bringing to this.
Yeah, and before I go into the detail of the book, based on what you've just said, in one of the interviews that I had with Gardner, the question was, we are in an age where we are being so manipulated. That you really have to find it necessary now to give a guideline on how to do that properly. And I liked his answer by saying, that it's already being done. If you look at all the media, the social media, and how it's done, But if you understand how it works, then you also have a form of resistance or some form of control in terms of having my mind changed or not. How do I participate in this process mindfully or mindlessly? You know. So
yeah, absolutely, and I think we call that Twitter. Yeah.
Well. There was an ex-president that tried that theory, so let's see. All right, cool. So just some general information. The book written by Howard Gardner, I'll tell you a bit more about him. It was published in 2004. It's about 288 pages. It reads easily. It's a complex subject, but he really has the ability to make it easy. He speaks to you in layman terms. It's about $17 at Kindle. It's not a how-to book. He explains the concepts and he shares stories within it, but it's not a recipe. And he really writes with a simplicity which I would almost coin as beyond complexity. So, and he really doesn't assume pre-knowledge about psychology, etc. in the book. So I think if one is in a leadership position and if you are attending a webinar like this would be quite a nice and an easy read for you.
And also he writes it from a first person perspective as well. It's like I've seen it this, I've grouped it like that, etc., which is interesting because actually after a while that has a big impact on you in reading the book, because like you're identifying with the I in the so it's an interesting book from that perspective as well.
Yeah. So the structure, he has a preface and then he has 10 chapters in which he just shares his research with us. You get most of the gist of it in the first 3 chapters. Chapters 4 to 9 is where he takes some of these concepts and he builds them out with examples, etc. And then he has a kind of an epilogue where he speaks about the future of mind change. I won't go into much detail about that, but he's got 3 avenues which he indicates. And then he has an appendix which he has nicely taken all the major concepts per chapter and just put it together in about a half a page each, which is a great way of consolidating the learning that is taking place or the reading that has taken place. So about the author, some of you have known him from other works, but he's a scholar at Harvard Graduate School of Education. He has positions at Harvard University as an adjunct professor in psychology and neurology at Boston. He is, you would remember him from a few years ago when he stormed the market with the whole notion of multiple intelligences, which we will touch a little bit on in this book as well. He is in collaboration with 2 other psychologists, Sixth Sense Mihaly and William Damon, and they are busy with a project around good work, so one would like to see what comes from that. He received a number of prizes in the past from universities and awards, etc. And he also received honorary degrees from about 20 colleges and universities across the world. So quite an accomplished scholar and someone that has been tested by his peers and by the market, etc. And he's still publishing, so there must be something in there.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that the book was actually published by Harvard Business School originally.
Just an interesting thing, Rian, in line with the book is while I'm sharing this about the author, I'm actually I'm using one of his levers, and that is research and reasoning to change the minds of those, because I don't know what's the reason for the audience joining us. Is it did you come and to get affirmation of what you think about changing minds, or have you come to cement your view that you can't change your mind, or did you come with an open mind to say, well, I'm here to listen and I'm open to be convinced, and somehow if this is the kind of author that's writing, maybe I should listen.
And something that I found interesting about him is that he started his work in early childhood development and then started working in how the brain breaks down in various accidents, etc. And he built up this theory of how the mind changes over time, and that is so. And he's got a fascinating chapter in the book around early childhood development and how we've got these preconceived notions, and that would be one of them. Is like your mind can't change, and you know, so that's so he really loves his kind of his academic side.
And in that chapter, he relies a lot on that Piaget's work that worked in the early childhood development. Yeah, no,
Awesome.
his work is well substantiated. So just a few introductory thoughts. I spoke about this in the beginning. He said we use this figure of speech, change the mind. So this phenomenon of changing mind is one of the least examined and the least understood of all human experiences, and hence he delved into that. And then he also makes a point at some early in the book and say, just remember, minds are hard to change. So this is not an easy how-to and go around and manipulating people's mental furniture and think that you will you will change it. There's an art and a science to it, and I would almost like to say there's also a kind of a moral principle behind it, but we'll get to that a bit later. Then, in terms of the last bullet there, so how he defines changing minds is when an individual or a group abandons the way in which they have customarily thought about an issue of importance.
Okay.
So my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Bostel, she writes the word inform like in dash form, coming from Italian informare, to shape, to change the form. So she says information comes in and it does one of three things. Either it confirms the current, or it destroys it, or it reshapes it into something else. And it's the same kind of notion that you have here in terms of mind. In the preface, he has this almost Rubik block, and this is the bringing together of the concepts, and he's got a formula there at the bottom, which he doesn't really go into, but he says if you're interested in working out the algorithm, you can go and you can go experiment with it. But you have the four entities of mind change, which are the contents, which means in our minds, and we'll get to a bit more detail, we have stories, the thoughts that we have got categorized as stories, theories, concepts, and skills. And then you have the arenas where you go and apply those 6 arenas where you going to look for changing minds or groups of minds to be changed in that space. And we'll deal with that detail in a moment. And then in that process, with this entities or content that you have applied to that arenas, you have 7 levers to work with in that space that people work with. So, and he puts it into this matrix, and suddenly you have what he calls 168 possibilities in combinations to work out. But it depends. It could be more. It could be more.
Yeah.
So if we go to the 4 entities first that he speaks about, he says the content of the mind. So we observe every day, and we gather information, and that information comes in, and we almost put it in in buckets to make sense of it. We have concepts, which he describes as the elementary unit. It's kind of an umbrella term to explain things that are maybe a bit difficult to find some form of a category or an idea. And these things could be intangible, or it could be tangible. So just think about it. A normal thing like a chair. We know it's got a back, it's got a seat, and it's got, mostly it's got 4 legs at the bottom. So we don't go into a room every time and say, here's a thing with a back and a seat and 4 legs. We have this concept of chair, or we have this concept of table, and that's how we have ordered it and labeled it in our mind. Or it could be intangible in terms of moral duties or some philosophical concept or whatever.
Yeah.
Then the other thing that we have is stories, because we also observe and we package some of the information in the form of stories, and especially if that information is coming in a kind of a sequence in time, and it gets a narrative feeling as it describes the unfolding of events.
Absolutely, and I think it is, the basis of competence is really understanding a set of key concepts at a level and being able to utilize those effectively. So, I fully agree that you can really change a person's mind and their actions, because ultimately that's where mind change leads. By presenting key concepts and changing the way that people experience those concepts.
Yeah. And then we have theories which take a little bit more thought, and it's kind of the observations that we make of this world. And funny enough, another psychologist in another book says we are all little professors. All human beings are little professors. We all have theories of life. All kinds of theories, and we go out there and we accumulate information to confirm our theories, and sometimes they challenge our theories of life. I think parents would know that before they have their first child, they've got this theory of how they're going to raise this child, and when this child is born, all those theories are thrown out by the door and they have to adopt new theories. But theories take a bit more thinking, more thought. It's a bit more formal, not just like stories, but a formal explanation of how things are being seen in the world, because we have observed that if I do that, then this happens. And if I do that often, it often happens like this. And so we build up theories in that process, and that's how we categorize that information. And then skills are the practices of which an individual is capable. So based on all of this, somehow, all of that thought enters into skills, and those are the skills that I also hold in my head as a mental mental content of the capabilities. Think students or they play music or laying bricks or do anything like that.
Exactly. I find that he's got this whole section on intuitive theories that I found fascinating, where we think, if it doesn't move, it isn't alive. And like these intuitive things that we learned as kids, and how that actually forms such a big sense of our perception later. And mind change is often related to taking some of these ideas and changing how we think about them. And one that I thought was quite interesting is like whenever we see something, we believe it's scarce. And because of that scarcity, we then tend to want to hoard it. But that if you corner the market on a particular item, then you've now won and you must share that with everybody. And those are kind of the intuitive theories that we've built over time. I thought that was such a fascinating way to look at it, and it would explain why everybody wants everybody else to give them stuff, because especially the billionaires of the world, because we think that, you know, if we run out of stuff and one person has it all, there is no more game to play. So now it must be shared out, you know, and that's something that you learned as a kid. Yeah, so very interesting how theories come into existence in our being and how we carry them, and this if-then kind of logic plays out in the real world today, where we say because all of these rich people have become so rich, they should give it to everybody else. You know, and that theory comes from a very kind of basic thing that we did when we were small, and to change that in people's minds it's not going to happen because it comes from such a deep root. Anyway, just sharing something that I read.
No, but I think it's important. I think the similar argument he has in that first chapter when he speaks about the 50-50 and the Pareto principle of 20-80.
Yeah.
Because we have that intuitive principle of everything needs to happen 50-50. But actually, if you look at research in different areas of life and in business, we see that 80-20 principle operating.
Exactly.
And if you understand that, then it challenges your intuitive 50-50 approach to life and to work, etc.
Absolutely.
So this is the content. So where do you take this content to? In which arena are you going to play with this content? And he says there are 6 arenas that we play in that space where we take this content to, and that is, and he has also indicated one should actually write it upside down like an inverted triangle, but basically on a large scale changes involve the diverse population of a region or a country. So what we spoke about in the beginning. So does one go to a South Africa, to a Brasilia, or to a particular region or whatever, and as a leader, how do you change the minds of the many? I mean, if we think of what Nelson Mandela did in '94, and the way that, and then also, I forgot to write her name in them, Margaret Thatcher, how she changed the way that Britain thought about itself and the economics and the world. So he stated categorically that the Britain before Thatcher and after Thatcher are 2 different Britons in that space.
Yeah.
So the content that we have, and we will get to the levers or the tools in a moment. So the content that we have, and we want to take it to large scale mind changes, needs to be packaged and used differently than we would go for if we go to the second one, where it's large scale change involving a more uniform or a homogeneous group. If you think of a company, a cultural change in a company, or a different strategic direction in a company, and you need people to think differently in that space, where the CEO needs to change the minds of the company's employees. So how is it done? How do you take either your concepts or your stories or your skills, etc., and how do you change minds in that space? Change is brought about through the works of art. He refers to Karl Marx. And you also referred to Karl Marx the other day in a story you told me, Rian, when was it the teacher who found you reading this thing, or where you commented on it?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, I got a hiding in grade 11, standard 9 back then, because this was the time of apartheid and the Rooi Gevaar, and this was a bad time. And so the teacher came up to us and told us in the Bible class that communism is bad, that it's going to corrupt our minds, and that we shouldn't ever be caught doing this. And I then, like a good scholar would, went and found the book and read it, and came back to the teacher and said, well, I didn't think his ideas were that revolutionary or anything. And next thing, I found myself in his the deputy principal's office, getting hiding at the tender age of I don't know, 16, got the hiding of my life, in an attempt probably to change my mind, around this topic. And 4 or 5 years later, the country was run by people that was brought up on this philosophy. So it was interesting that the kind of large-scale change also changes the narrative and the behaviors of individuals, because, I mean, that deputy principal's job was to make sure that nobody believed in communism.
So you have
to that. I don't know if I do believe in it at all, but it definitely was entrenched in society at that time.
And it was a collision and colliding of two different worlds in terms of two different minds in that space. But if you think of Darwin, the work that Darwin did, and I mean, there is still to this day, Darwin being challenged by all kinds of people and people that have fundamental beliefs about things that Darwin was trying to prove in that space. And in spite of all research, etc., people still stay with that. So back to one of the beginning slides, changing of minds is a difficult thing.
But the Darwin case is also so interesting, Fred, because at the time that Darwin proposed the theory of evolution, there was a guy by the name of Lamarck, and Lamarck's basic view was it isn't a single molecule in the middle and a DNA sequence that determines what you will end up. It's also the environment is shifting you. So. And now what's interesting, the latest research, which is called epigenetics, has proven that Lamarck was probably right. Okay, but at the time, because Darwin was using a scientific and a very provable approach and wrote this tome, which he was petrified to release. He only released it at the end of his life, and only because there was this challenge of him being outpublished. Because he said this will change everything, okay? And Lamarck was discredited after that and kind of died in relative obscurity and being scientifically ridiculed. But 150 years or 100 years later, Lamarck's ideas are actually the basis of what we're observing, having a better understanding of science. So it's interesting how that debate was kept alive sort of slowly on the side, and then in the last 5-10 years, it really shifted fundamentally. So, but if he hadn't done that work, we might have, for the rest of our lives, thought that Darwin's theory was the only way to look at it. So it's interesting how these things interact over time.
Now that piece of information to me is very interesting. So I'm deviating for 10 seconds here.
No problem.
Because C.W. Graves, who was the student of Maslow, based on their research, said it's like this vector, and the psychosocial development of a society happens because of that genetics that are sitting there almost like programs, computer programs, but you also then have life conditions on this side, and these life conditions trigger these
exactly.
programs to start developing, and it was popularized by Don Beck in the spiral dynamics. So very interesting, same kind of thoughts in that space. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm digressing.
It's all good.
And then the fourth arena is the changes with formal instructional settings like schools and training seminars and webinars like this, etc. Where you then there's a particular program, there's a particular curriculum, and we send our children there, or we go there from a university point of view, and then we are provided with this information coming in, and we have debates happening, and we are being tested, and we have to answer certain questions, or we have to present cases, and in that process there are mind changes or mind shift. And I think he makes a very important point at some point and say changing of mind is not always kind of like switching on a light on and off. It is many times it is a slow process, and sometimes it's a slow process, and then there's an event, and then that it almost flips into that space.
Yeah, and he has many interesting stories in the book around people that have over long times had certain views, then obviously changed, and like how that changes society as well. So imagine like your top leader now all of a sudden comes and presents a different view because they come to some realization. It makes us reflect at society, like why did we believe that up to now? Because these big names did, and now they're turning around and say they don't believe that anymore. You know, and that changes fundamentally. I thought a recent example was quite interesting. Elon Musk saying that Bitcoin is not good because it's not good for the environment. And you know, that's an interesting idea because it's a big idea to sit and say, well, yeah, it is actually probably not good for the environment. It made the coin fall, but it also now sets a challenge to make it good for the environment. You know, that's the kind of things where those big changes really changes the way that we think about what needs to happen into the future.
So the fifth one is the kind, what he calls the intimate forms of mind changing. That's between a couple or in a family where there's a close gathering of people. It's an intimate space of friends, or when you work with your children. Now you can just imagine in that space, especially when you work with your children, and let's assume they are not teenagers yet because they allow you to work with their mental furniture. So, but now you try and instill certain values, etc., of the family, and there's agreement and there's some form of harmony because parent and child believe in the same thing. Now you move just back to the previous arena. Now the child enters that arena and they are take sex education that they had recently in the papers. Now suddenly there's a collision between arena 5 and 4 because I don't want my child to be taught that in that manner, etc. So it's a difficult space to be in. And then of course it says the sixth arena is that of one's own mind, the changing of one's own mind in terms of, say, a diet or an exercise. I feel so guilty when I say the word exercise, or smoking, or marriage, or divorce, etc. Because those things in your life has an impact on the mind that is changing in that space. So, and just this is how he represents it in the how he says we should actually look at it. So
I'm always intrigued to put a time scale next to these things and ask which one is more difficult. Yeah, because in my life it takes far longer to change my own mind than to see all these large scale changes.
Yeah. But that's now the challenge. If you take yourself now, you multiply it by 50 million, you get to the top in South Africa. And now you want to change not just your own, but 50 million. So that's the challenge. That's the challenge. So now we have this content. There's the arena. So what tools do we have to operate in that arena, in the changing of minds, whether it's our own or a large-scale change? So he almost has this notion of horses for courses. He doesn't really use the words like that, but you have different audiences with different individuals. So you have to also focus in a different way. And then what he calls that are levers for mind changing. Now, incidentally, and I don't know why this happened and what his rationale is fully for this, but every one of these levers starts with the letter R, and incidentally also with the second letter E. And so I have... He refers to it, but I have now taken the liberty to accentuate what he says. So the first lever, he says, going, and you have to decide in terms of the previous session of that inverted triangle. So which of these levers would be or a combination of levers would work best in those spaces. So reason is when we kind of appeal to someone's reason, is the kind of logic, because that's where you hope there will be some kind of deduction, an induction, where there will be a kind of an analogies drawn between certain things. There's categories of thought being presented in that space. It's rational. All those things that you find in reason. If you think of the philosopher Descartes, who says, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. So this is very strongly embedded in that sense of reason. Then he speaks of research as a lever. So you gather data, you've got evidence, you've got statistical analysis, anecdotes, all kinds of things that you have in your toolbox coming from research which you can use then. Then there is resonance, which is exceptionally important concept, which means if the content is delivered, do I click with it? Does it resonate with me? Is the presenter of the content trustworthy? So it's very important, that assessment, that resonance, to ensure that there's kind of an emotional yes on my side. I can relate to this, and we often say this. I can relate to that.
And he was actually one of the first guys that talking about this resonance concept, where you have to connect with it emotionally, and it has to be consistent with your belief. Then it resonates. And I think he was actually one of the first people that posited that. And like now, it's so common for us to say, well, I resonate with that. But I think he injected that word into the language.
Yeah. The more difficult one to explain in this is the fourth one, which he calls redescription. He's got a longer name for it: representation, redescription. And all he wants to convey with that is, the more you can take the same content and present it in different forms, almost addressing different intelligences. When we get to the multiple intelligence, addressing more, the better your chance of having an impact or somewhere moving towards changing a particular mind. And then he has
it's storytelling. It's storytelling. I mean, and we tell the same stories over and over, and then we redescribe it, and every time the story changes a little bit, and then we start believing it.
Yeah. And then he has rewards, which we very much know as parents, that sometimes we overstep our boundaries there with rewards. You do that, I'll give you something. The problem is when and then you change minds. But then when you stop the reward, they flip back to the old mindset, because the rewards are not there to keep it intact. But rewards are kind of material resources that one can use as incentives for changing minds. So if we do this, and if you do this, and if you collaborate here, I will give you that. And so people's minds are changed. Then real world events, sometimes things happen out there, actual forces of nature, of events, or wars, or 9/11, or things like that happen. And then there's many times that creates a mind change of note in either leaders or individuals or groups or companies, etc. And then he makes a point and say that when we think of these levers and of changing minds, we very seldom really consider the other lever, and that is of resistance. And that is where some people are feeling very strongly about an existing viewpoint, and they do not want their minds changed. So you almost have these two models of a fundamentalist model, and this is where I'm stuck, and everything I veer off coming in my direction. Or the other one is kind of an openness, a willingness to listen. I know one of the Afrikaans authors of many years ago said, from a worldview, you must live like someone in a room with a very big window and you look into the garden of others. And sometimes you must walk out the door, go and walk with them in their garden and come back to your room, but you won't return the same person as the one that went out of that door. So that's kind of sense of suggesting the openness vis-a-vis the fundamentalist.
Yeah.
So
and he makes a good point on changing fundamentalism in terms of removing the resistances, the blocks of resistance, and then fundamentally the person realizes at the end of it that, well, that was, I only built up my fundamentalism on the resistance. So if I remove the barriers in the resistance, then that also shifts the fundamentalism. So very interesting theory that he builds there.
So we have content in the mind, those four kind of pockets of content. We have those 6 arenas where we can apply it. And then there are these 7 levers, which are the tools, which one could use. He spoke about leaders and political leaders and kind of what intelligence is and what levers they pull and what they can pull, but I will leave it up to those that are interested to go and read it, because it is really a significant piece of information that is captured in this particular book. Let me see if I have any other notes on this particular one here. Okay, so he then also returns to the multiple intelligences. So here's the thing. He says we have content, but that content is expressed outside in different forms, because you give form to that content. So think of different shapes of glasses, a red wine glass, a champagne flute, a tumbler, James Bond's, what do you call that?
Martini glasses, yeah.
Yeah. So you take the same content, the same wine, and you pour it into those glasses, and the content take up the shape of the glass. So this is kind of the notion of behind the multiple intelligences. Now you will see I've got a word up there that's called mentalese, and I have struck it through, and it's not because I forgot to delete it. It is because of the notion in psychology, and that's actually the term that they have for it. It's called mentalese. It's their view of the mind, especially behaviorists. It's their view on the mind that there's only one kind of thought, and that's why you have this cognitive intelligence, and where we have the IQ tests, etc. But now, with his research and what he has done, he says, nah, we may have to think differently about this. Because of the work, Rian, that you refer to, that he saw that was done by children, with the early childhood development, and especially some people that for some reason had brain damage, or they didn't have certain faculties. They could speak and see, but they can't necessarily hear, or they can hear, but they cannot speak. And all of those people have presented information intelligently, have done works of art, etc. So he says there surely must be other forms of thought. So there's not just one form of thought. There are different forms of thought, which is being shown by artists who thinks in terms of images or certain forms, or by musicians who think in sound. Or ballet dancers that think in terms of movement. So if those are different forms of thought, then those are also intelligences. And you are not intelligent in every situation. I mean, can you imagine me being intelligent on a ballet dance floor? That's crazy. So
is that a test of my ability to visualize something?
I'm trying to change your mind here. So So as there are many kinds of thoughts, his reasonable deduction initially was, then there must be multiple forms of intelligence, and that's the area in which he did his research, and he came up with. You will see only 8 here. I've left out the ninth one, and I will explain it in a moment. So that one thought worldview is called mentalese, and he challenged that mentalese with his research, and he came up with multiple intelligences. So the first one he speaks about is the linguistic intelligence, and because you get people that are truly excellent conversationalists and storytellers. I mean, we all know them. They may be not as good in other situations, but when it comes to conversation or when it comes to storytelling, they are absolutely brilliant, and they change people's minds with that.
Absolutely. I think Cyril Ramaphosa is a good example of a linguistically intelligent person.
Yeah. Then he says there's the logical, mathematical mind. So that's the mind that sits there that can do the analysis, analyzing data, synthesizing data, etc. Then there's the music intelligence, the capability of melody or harmony, musical structures. Then spatial intelligence, where you use your when you use your sense of space, especially pilots or architects. I would even say Formula One car drivers, because they have to have a very strong sense of spatial intelligence to move through all of those gaps and handle that vehicle in that space. And then you have the bodily kinesthetic intelligence, which you see in artisans, in surgeons, in athletes. And this was the interesting one for me, the naturalistic intelligence. One would say, isn't he pushing that a bit too far? But if you think back 100 years or so, or even today in certain areas of the world, where you have to be intelligently able to distinguish between certain rocks and certain trees and plants, whether you eat and survive on that. How do you, on what basis do you plant and sow and reap based on weather patterns that you understand? So this comes from our distant ancestors, but it's not as if that intelligence is lost. But the fact is, he acknowledges it as an intelligence.
I think it's an awesome thing to acknowledge and to explore as well, because I think there's been some good research which says that we still we still smell like hunters, and that's a sense that you can train. So that you can find things, etc. So we haven't lost it, we just don't use it. We can hear as well as bats, and there's many kind of natural sense-orientated things that we've got inherent built-in intelligences, but we don't actually actively cultivate it. But some people have it and have it overdeveloped from the very beginning. Yeah.
So I'm not going to go into the detail, but just make a side note. There was about 3-4 years ago on the radio, there was this anthropologist that went to live with a group of the Khoisan in the Kalahari. He wanted to stay there for about 3-4 weeks. I think he stayed for 7 years with them.
Okay.
And his feedback to us as the modern society is there's a reason why the first people are still with us. We have to learn from them. And the kind of intelligence that he picked up in terms of nature, the ability to see things which he can't even see with a binocular, and when they walk there, they actually find exactly, and it's not an old object, it's a moving animal. And the number of animals they find there exactly as this gentleman has shown in that space. So that's a different kind of, and I think some of our other modern people, if you think of the work that somebody like Wim Hof does, some of the work that, what's the gentleman's name who does with the meditation, where it's the effectiveness of that represents some form of an intelligence which in the modern world is difficult to penetrate the current modern mindset, but it's effective.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's the intrapersonal intelligence, which is understanding yourself, knowing what you do best, and then you use that intelligence about yourself to operate effectively in the world out there. And then the interpersonal intelligence, the capability to cooperate with others. And that's too many times I see a big lack of that intelligence, especially amongst politicians. But in any case,
is that called social media? No. And is that making us smarter or less smart with our interpersonal intelligence? I'm very intrigued. But anyway, we don't have to explore that today.
The ninth one he has is existential intelligence, which there is not enough research on, and which I think needs a lot of work still, and which deals with spirituality and philosophy in that space. So,
why are we here?
there's the content. There are the arenas. Those are the levers. These are the intelligences. And then, interestingly, he says, if you are a leader, you must use your linguistic intelligence. Not too much of your logical, mathematical intelligence, but you must use your linguistic intelligence and your intrapersonal intelligence to be strong on operating out there. So if you have, and when you lead people, it would seem a not too bad combination in terms of the levers is to use your logic, use research so that you have proof of what you are trying to present to people, why they should change in the organization or the team, etc., and then ensure that there's resonance. Is the information and the way that I present it, is it trustworthy? Am I trustworthy? Is it likable?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you start putting that together to say, here's a powerful map of what motivates people, what's the level at which that needs to operate. And then what he does in the book is he gives analysis that utilizes aspects of this to see how people have changed things. So it becomes a very kind of practical, not practical, I guess that's the wrong word here, but a very informative read in terms of understanding the motivations and how people utilize that both positively and negatively to influence people. And I think it's what I found, it forces you to reflect on how you're being influenced, but also what influence are you exerting on others, sometimes indirectly or unconsciously, and how does that affect them? And I guess as you are looking at larger structures and in bigger roles, you don't always realize that that's your impact. And I think that's what makes it such a powerful reflection for leaders.
Yeah. So with all of this, he is confronted. What we started off with is, but can we manipulate people like this? Well, first of all, manipulation is not always bad. So when we associate it only with the dark side, but it's not really true. But the second thing is, he says this is like a tool, and he goes into this value-free, almost objectively. I mean, teaching is a skill and lever. So, and you can teach people the wrong things, or you can teach them the right things. You can have works of art that has a positive impact on people, or you can works of art that destroys people. Same with science, etc. So it's not in the thing itself that's bad; it's how we use it, which makes it either good or bad. Interesting thing that he says, just on a side note here, he says that intrapersonal intelligence is a double-edged sword, because especially for a leader, if you spend too much time internally thinking about yourself and thinking of how you should behave, and you stay, then you kind of lose it. You lose your way as a leader. So yes, you have to understand that, but you must be intelligent enough to come out and go and live there in an interpersonal environment.
No, and it's so interesting. It reminds me also of the artist way, where it was like you shouldn't do this too much because you'll fall in love with your own stuckness and come up with great theories of who you are, why you are, but what are you doing about it? So I think that's kind of the kind of execution intelligence of being intelligent, like just knowing something and knowing how to do it isn't always the only way. You actually need to do something about it in society as a leader. And interpersonal intelligence doesn't always help with that, although I think it does kind of touch on that point that you had as well around creating a moral touch point. Because, yeah, just the fact that you can change people doesn't mean you should. And if you are, then it does put a big, are planning to do that, yeah, takes a big responsibility and gives you a big ethical consideration around how am I doing this? Am I doing it correctly? And you couldn't do that well without an interpersonal intelligence.
So in his last chapter, he kind of take a look at the future, and he says changing of the mind will happen in what he calls wetware, dryware, and goodware. And with wetware, he's kind of referring to the strategic interventions on our brains at the moment, and where he says there is a link between brain changing and mind changing, and it becomes a matter of knowledge rather than speculation, prayer, luck, or idiosyncratic artistry. Idiosyncratic artistry. So, and I think he refers also to this kind of notion where you have implants and where the interaction between machine and man is in that space, and in his mind, that's not going to stop. That's rather happening, and it's going to happen. And it would be interesting to see how brain change and mind change. And then he speaks of dryware. Scholars have proceeded with equal gusto through the study of information systems and artificial intelligence, dryware, and how do we merge human and artificial cognition that he foresee to be pervasive. And then the thing that we just spoke of, goodware, all of which begs the question of value judgment. Is changing minds through such boundary blurring a good or a bad thing? And he concludes, neither science nor technology is good or bad in itself, is how we put it to use. And that, Rian and audience, is this book. I think it was a great book to read. I really enjoyed it. I think it demands a second read at least. But if anything, you are warned. This is how they change your minds. These are the levers that they pull. If you don't want your mind changed, use this information to your benefit. And
absolutely.
Guard your walls.
Absolutely. Frek, I think it's and kind of just to summarize from my perspective, it's the book was really good, and it reminds us to think about the things that's happening in society now, especially this wetware, dryware, goodware. I think if you follow that, there's a new AI that was recently built, Wu Dao, that operates with 1.75 trillion parameters that is being compared to the first possible sentient intelligence. We can very soon get brain implants, and the goodware side of really understanding what is good and bad, and how that is also changing rapidly in our society. And I think a book like this gives you the tools to look at that objectively and to understand both your approach and also how you are working within that. And yeah, I thank you for making me read it. I think I learned something in there, and yeah, looking forward to working that into our courses over the next short while.
All right, so then goodbye to our audience. Hope you have found some value in this, that the mental furniture was not upset too much in this space. This is recorded and will be available. You can just, where on our website, there's a link on the website.
Where you found the invite for this, you'll find that, yes, and on our website, yes.
Cool.
Okay, thank you. And we'll be back in a week or two, maybe with another book, and look out for the Executive Book Club. It is always fun having you, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to at least challenge yourself to think about things a little bit better. Okay, thank you.
Well, bye.
Cheers. Bye.